I'm Paula Storm. Thanks for joining me today on my YouTube channel. So this week we're working on our Seminole piecing. This is actually my favourite row of all of them to actually sew. It goes together really quickly and easily, and it's so accurate. That's what I love about it. Now, Seminole piecing was originally inspired in quilting by the American Indian tradition. It's a style of piecing that, as I said, is really quick and it's surprisingly accurate. It was originally done in kind of like a strip piecing technique, and it was used a lot in traditional Indian dresswear and clothing. And of course, we as quilters have really picked it up and run with it. Now there's two parts to this Seminole piecing, the outside sections, which has the strippy bits, and then we've got the inside, which is more of a block based on point. Now originally when I was looking for a design to include in the quilt along, I wanted to do Seminole piecing, so I was researching and I found that the strippy design is actually traditionally called the storm design. So of course I had to include it in our quilt along. Okay, let's get started. First of all, we need some strips. Now, I've got my background fabric here. I'm using a light background, but if you're using whichever fabric you're using, this is your background fabric. Now, we need 6 strips that are half the width of the fabric, so about 22 inches. This doesn't have to be perfect because we are going to be trimming it up later. So we've got 6 of those in the background fabric, and then we've also got our coloured fabrics. Now, once again, I'm using these beautiful K-Facet fabrics, and I've chosen 6 different fabrics that are also 6 inches by about 22 inches, so half the width of the fabric. I've cut these from fat quarters, so that's what I've got there. Now the first thing we need to do is we need to separate these into 2 piles. Now we need 3 of each, so I've got 3 of my background fabrics, another 3 background fabrics, and then I need to split these up. So you want to choose which order you want these to run in. So for me, I'm going to do a rainbow, so I want the colours to be in this order. I want red, orange, yellow, green, purple, and I'm using this as a blue, but it's really a black. So what we need to do is we need to divide them into 2 piles. We need fabric 1, fabric 3 and fabric 5 in one pile, and we need fabric 2, 4 and 6 in another pile. So I'm going to do that first of all. So I'm going to take out my red, put that on the first pile, take my orange in the second pile, yellow and green, and then of course the purple and my blue. So there's my first 2 piles. I'm going to class this as pile 1 and this is pile 2. So I'm going to put pile 2 to the side for now, and we're going to start with pile 1. Now this technique sort of goes back to what we did in week 2. So do you remember when we did the scrappy squares and we had to offset each piece of fabric by a few inches to get it to line up properly when we cut it? So what I need to do for the first pile is I need to offset these. Let me move that so you can see. I need to offset these so that they're about 4 inches different. So can you see there? When I line it up, I want about 4 inches at the start. Now I'm including the selve edge in that 4 inches. So if we look at the cutting mat, we've got 1, 2, 3, 4 inches is here. So that's where I want my red fabric to start. So I'm going to join these 2 together using a scant 1/4 inch seam, and I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other 2 fabrics from pile 1, so fabrics 3 and fabrics 5. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the exact same thing with the other pile. I'm going to have my background fabric on top, so let me move this out of the way so you can see. Once again, I'm going to have my background fabric on top, and then so actually I'd like you to be able to see both of these in the same screen. Then when I take my next piece, I actually want to offset it in the opposite direction. So if I have my background fabric here, I want the 4 inches to be out the bottom like that. So in the first pile, we've got the 4 inches here. In the second pile, we have the 4 inches here. So you can see what I mean, they're in opposite directions, so that when we come to trim them later, they'll line up beautifully. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to go and sew all of these together, and then I'll come back and show you how we cut. Okay, so there we go. That's the first pieces sewn together. So all you need to do is just make sure that they're like that. Then what we need to do is we need to start cutting. Now, I like to use as small a ruler as I can get away with, because I find the smaller the ruler, the more accurate the cutting. But the only ruler I have with me at the moment is my big long 18 or 24-inch ruler, so I'm going to use this one just for the demonstration. Okay, now the next thing we need to do is we need to start cutting this strip set. So I'm going to call this strip set 1. We need to start cutting this up into smaller pieces. So what you need to do is you need to find the 45-degree line on your ruler. Now I'll just lift that up a little bit, and I hope you can see that the 45-degree line runs along here. So we're going to take that 45-degree line and line it up across the bottom of the piece. So I'm lining it up across against the coloured piece of fabric, and I'm lining it up across the bottom. Now I'm just shifting the ruler back so that when I cut this, I'm not wasting too much fabric. And this is why we do that step along, because if I hadn't stepped it along, everything under here would have been waste and I wouldn't have had enough fabric in the end. So just make sure that you move your ruler back until you're wasting as little fabric as possible. So I'm going to make my first cut along that 45-degree line. And there we go, that's the only waste that we have from this piece. So I'll get rid of that. Now the next thing we need to do is we need to turn the ruler and we need to cut some strips. Now these strips need to measure 1.5 inches from that 45-degree cut line. So I'm going to line up my 1.5 inch mark, and I'm going to make my first cut. And there's my first piece cut. So I'm just going to put that to the side, and I'm going to continue cutting like that until I have a total of 6 of these pieces. And I'm going to do that from all of the strip set 1 pieces. So we had the colour number 1, which is the red. We're going to do the same thing for colour number 3 and colour number 5. So we'll do all that cutting. So there's 2. Now every so often you might want to just check that your 45-degree line is still accurate. In this case it's not super important, but when you're cutting on the bias it is quite important to keep that degree line as straight as possible. So there's 3. And there we go. So that's the first 6 that we need from colour number 1. Now you would be able to get a few extras out of this piece if you wanted to, but I'm not going to use this for anything else, so I'm just going to pop that into my scrap basket, and you never know, I might use it in another project another time. So I'm going to repeat that step with both of, as I said, both the other colours from that fabric 3 and fabric 5, and then I'm going to head over to the strip set 2s. Now you may remember that this time we have the background fabric moved along this way rather than the other way. So what we need to do in this case is we need to cut the 45-degree angle in the opposite direction. So we need to line up our 45-degree line along the bottom edge here rather than this way. And by doing it this way we're going to get opposite angles, which is going to really help with our piecing later on. Now I'm actually going to change the angle of this to make it easier for me to cut. So I'm actually going to put it this way, and then I'll line up my 45-degree line along the bottom here, push it back as far as I can, and then I'll make my first cut. Once again, this is waste, so I'm going to throw that away, and then I'm going to cut my 6 1.5 inch pieces from this fabric. And once I cut these, you'll notice if I bring back in one of the other pieces, once I line them up, if I switch this one around, can you see how I have the background fabrics are in opposite directions and I have my colours in the opposite sides, but I also have this really awesome point here, and that's what we're going for in this whole row. So you want to cut out all of your pieces, and I'll do that, and then I'll come back and show you how to lay it all out and piece it all together. Okay, so here we are with all our pieces cut. Now as you can see, I've got them all with the background fabric across the top there. But for the actual piecing, what we want to do is we want to flip around every second one. So I'm going to take my orange and flip it upside down, and then I'm going to take the green, flip it upside down, and then take my blue or black and flip it upside down. So now I've got the colour on top, the orange colour down the bottom, and I'm going to join those two together. Now the only important thing to do here is to make sure that these 2 points line up. It doesn't matter about the top, it doesn't matter about the bottom, because we're going to trim that off in the end anyway. So that's what I love about this technique. It's really easy and quick and really accurate without really having to try. Now because we've pressed all of our seam allowances toward, I'm just going to move them out of the way, because we've pressed all our seam allowances towards the background fabric, all I need to do is flip this one upside down, and you'll find that what that does is it automatically makes the background fabric seam, or the seam allowances nest without much effort at all. So if I turn it on the side there, I'm not sure if you can see, but it nests those seam allowances, so you're going to get a perfect point without really even trying. So what I like to do is I like to nest those seams. If you want to, you could pop a pin in here and here just to keep it straight. It's not really essential. And then take it to your machine, and you want to sew a scant 1/4 inch seam straight down that edge. So line them up neatly. Make sure those seams nest so you get a beautiful point, and then stitch this seam all the way down here. Repeat that with these ones. So once again, we'll take that, flip it over, nest that seam, line up the edges and stitch down here. So I like to lay them out like this, and then when I take them to the machine, all I need to do is make sure that I've got the colour on top closest to me when I'm sewing it through the machine. So I'll start stitching here and sew all the way through. I'll do the same here, stitch all the way through, making sure the colour's closest to me and the background fabric that's on top goes through the machine first. That way I know all of the seams are going to be sewn in the same direction, rather than accidentally flipping this one over, for example, and feeding the colour fabric through first. That will make the seam allowance on the wrong side. So just make sure when you feed it through the machine, the background fabric goes through first and you've got the colour closest to you. So I'm going to sew these together and then I'll show you what they look like. Now one thing I forgot to mention, that all of these edges are bias edges, so they will stretch if you put any sort of pressure on them. So just be really careful when you're feeding it through the machine to make sure that you're not stretching this out or putting any pressure on the seams. Okay, so here we go. There's our first 3 pieces. Now what we want to do is we want to press these seam allowances open, because if we press them to one side, we're going to end up with an awful lot of bulk at this point and we might lose the points. See how beautiful that point is? And I didn't even pin. I just fed it through, making sure that both of these seams nested, and we've got a beautiful point without really even trying. Let's have a look at this one. Yep, beautiful. And the next one. Perfect. Okay, so I'm going to take these to the ironing board. I'm going to press the seam allowances open. Now you can do this by hand if you like. You can just get your fingernail inside, open up that seam allowance and just use your thumbnail or any fingernail to just run your nail along that seam. And that just finger presses it open. I would then take it to the iron and give it a good press. Now don't iron. I'm not overly careful when I press unless I have a bias seam, which is exactly what this is. So you just want to make sure you just pop the iron down gently and press, and then lift up, press, lift up, press. I would also press from the right side. So by finger pressing that seam open, I can press from the top, so I make sure there's no little tucks and I make sure that that point is perfect. So I'll go along, finger press them all open, and then we can get to the fun bit of joining them all together. And there they are, all my beautifully pressed little arrows. So what I would do now is go and grab the rest of my pieces and sew them all up to this stage. Give them all a press, and then I would start joining them together. So then I would take the first part and the second part and join them together. Once again, when you flip it over, those seams are going to nest beautifully right there. And as I said earlier, this is the only seam that matters. That's the only place that you need to get points. We're going to trim the top and the bottom off, so it doesn't matter if they line up or not. It's only this middle section that matters. So make sure that one lines up. So I would once again sew that seam, press the seam allowance open, and then I will do the same with this one. So again, flip it upside down, stitch that seam, and then press the seams open. So let's take these to the machine and we'll sew them together. And there we go, that's them all sewn together. So we've got our beautiful points matching all the way along without much effort at all. And if I flip it over, you can see it's all pressed beautifully with the seams pressed open. And I find that that really helps to, when you come to the quilting stage, to get a really nice effect from your quilting. So what we need to do is we need to make a total of 6 sets like this. And then we're going to join 3 of them together for one side of the quilt, and we're going to join the other 3 together for the opposite side of the quilt. The last thing we need to do is we need to trim this piece to size. Now the easiest way to do that is to turn it on its side, and as I mentioned, you will have 3 of these sections joined together. So this is one section of 6, so we've got 6 pieces here. You'll have another 2 lots of 6 joined onto the end, but I just wanted to do a small piece to demonstrate for you today. So what we need to do is we need to take a ruler, and a smaller ruler would be easier, but I don't have one that's the right width. Anyway, what we need to do is we need to measure from the very tips of those points. So you can see that's the outside point. I'd class this as the inside point. So from the outside point, we need to measure 3 1/4 inches. So you can see that 3 1/4 inches is hitting those points perfectly. So that high point, that high point. Now on the outsides, it will actually be 3 inches because we haven't taken away that 1/4 inch seam yet. So on the 2 ends, the point will be at the 3 inch mark, but on the sharp points here, it'll be 3 1/4. And so I'm just going to trim across that top edge like so. And that's going to be our waist. Then I'm going to flip it around. And if you've got a wide enough ruler, you'll be able to measure just from the end this time. And we want that to measure 7 1/2 inches. But because I've only got this 6 inch ruler, once again, I'm going to measure from the 3 1/4 inch point here, 3 1/4 inches here, and 3 1/4 inches here. And I'm going to trim across that top edge. And there we go, that's our strip set. And so that should measure 7 1/2 inches. So spot on. So that's what we need to do with the 2 outside pieces for our row this week. Okay, so once you've got that done, we can set that aside and we can move on to part 2. Okay, moving on to part 2. Now these are the fabrics that we're going to need to cut. We need 1 yellow strip which measures 1 3/4 inches by 12 inches long. We need 2 different purple fabrics. We have a 1 3, or both of them are 1 3/4 inches wide. One of them is 12 inches long and the other is 6 inches long. Then we move on to our green fabrics. We need 1 rectangle which is 3 inches by 6 inches, and we need 3 pieces that are 1 3/4 inches by 3 inches. So we need 3 of those. And then we need our background fabrics. Now once again I've used my light fabric and I've got 6 5 1/2 inch by 6 inch rectangles. So that's all the cutting that we need to do for the middle section of the Seminole piecing strip. Okay, first up we're going to put everything aside except the 2 long yellow and purple strips. And all we want to do is join them together down the length of the piece. While you're sewing, you could also sew these 2 together while you're there and just join those 2 once again down the long edge. Okay, so there they are. We'll put this one aside for now and we're going to start with this piece. Now what we want to do is we want to cut this strip into 6 sections, and they need to measure 1 3/4 inches this way. So there'll be 3 inches this way and 1 3/4 inches this way. When I start cutting, I don't actually cut the edge off like that because there's nothing for me to line it up against. So what I like to do is I like to move my ruler over and just leave a little bit extra. So when I need to cut this piece underneath, I need to cut it at 1 3/4. I'll leave it at about 1 7/8, and then I'll trim it off. So I'll cut like this. Then what I can do is I can flip it around and trim off that excess at the perfect 1 3/4 inches. I'm lining up through that center seam on my ruler, and I'm checking both the top and the bottom to make sure they're square. But by doing that, I get a perfect strip without having to worry about squaring up that first edge first. So I'm going to put that to one side, and I'm going to continue cutting. Now I've cleaned up that edge, I'm just going to keep going at the 1 3/4 inches, and I'm also going to make sure that my ruler is lined up through that center seam there. So we'll keep going until we've got a total of 6 of these. And there's my scrap. So we'll put that to the side. Now what we're doing is we're just basically making some 4 patch blocks. So that's what we need for the center. So what I need to do is I need to take every second one and flip it around and join them together like so. So we end up with 3 perfect 4 patch blocks. So I'm going to join those together. Of course, when I flip it over, I'm going to nest that seam perfectly so it lines up beautifully and I get perfect points in the center. So I'm going to take that to the machine and I'll stitch that seam on all 3 blocks. Okay, so I've sewn my 3 little blocks together. I'm just going to trim those apart because, as usual, I've just strip pieced those. Now I just want to show you a little trick before I press. Now what I like to do with 4 patch blocks, I'm just going to zoom in a little bit closer. Okay, so what I like to do, instead of pressing my seam allowance to one side, which you would normally do with a 4 patch, what I like to do is I like to spiral my seam on the back. Now what you need to do is you need to flip it over. So here's my nested seam. So can you see I've got the seam at the back is going that direction and the seam at the front is going this direction. What I want to do is I just want to pop out those few stitches that are joining this part of the seam together. So just those very few stitches, I want to get rid of those. You don't actually need to use an unpicker. What you can do is just pop them apart by just pulling it apart like so. So see how I've got that tiny little 4 patch when I pop it open? I'm just going to open this out now and press it back, and there you go, there's the little 4 patch in the center. And what that does is it evenly distributes all those seam allowances around the center of the block, so that when you flip it over and press it, you get a perfectly flat block. See how flat it's laying before I even press it? And I get to see my perfect center join there. So let me show you that again. I'll move that to the side. See, I haven't even pressed it and it's just laying perfectly flat because I've spiraled that seam. When I flip it over, see how we've got that beautiful 4 patch in the center. So I'll show you again. What I want to do is just these few stitches here. Just those 2 stitches. If you want to, you can use an unpicker, but personally I just give it a tug, pull it apart like so, open out my piece, and those seam allowances just lay beautifully flat, one on either side. So this seam allowance goes this way, this seam allowance goes this way, and when you look at the whole piece, you can see that the seam allowances are all spiraling around in a circle. I do that as often as possible, always when I'm doing a 4 patch, but when I'm doing all my piecing, I try and spiral those seams as often as I can, because as you can see, it just lays beautifully flat. And when you're quilting, your machine quilter will just love you if you do this, because it just it's so easy to quilt because you don't have all, 6 or 8 layers of fabric built up in the center. So one more time, I'm going to show you, I just slide my index finger in the back there, and I usually slide my thumb in the front. So I've got, my fingers aren't covering the seam allowance on top, they're slid in between, and then I've got my index finger on the other side doing the exact same thing, just slid under that seam allowance, and then I just pull in opposite directions, and it just pops those few stitches out so that we can spiral those beautiful 4 patch seams. So I'm going to take this to the iron and give it a press, and we're ready to move on to the next stage. Okay, so we've got our 3 4 patches. There they are for our individual blocks. The next step is to take our green strips, and sew them to one side. Now what we need to be sure of is to make sure that we have those green pieces in the right position, and I've actually got them wrong. What I need to do is spin this one around. I'm going to do all of them, okay, so that I have the yellow in the top right hand corner and I've got yellow in the bottom left hand corner. And what I want to do is I want to attach the green to that side. So I'm going to take all 3 of my blocks to the machine and I'm going to stitch those down. Okay, here they are. So I'm going to snip those apart, take them to my iron, and this time I'm going to press the seam allowance towards the green. So I'm just going to fold that back and press the seam allowance that way. Okay, so we're up to that stage. We're going to put that aside and bring in our other little piece here that we've got that we sewed earlier. So what we need to do now is cut these into 1 3/4 inch strips. So I'm going to take my ruler once again. I'm going to move it over a bit further than the 1 3/4 inches. I'm lining up my fabric through the center join and I'm going to trim my first block. I move this before I even take my hand off the ruler to get a nice clean cut. Spin this around and then I'll line up the 1 3/4 inches again, and I'll also line up my ruler through that join so I make sure I've got a perfect seam. So that's scrap, and I just need 2 more of those, so now, and 3. So now I want to join these to this section here. Now I've made a bit of a mistake. When I sewed this piece onto here, I've pressed my seam allowance to the green fabric. But when I sewed this purple fabric to the green, I've actually pressed the seam allowance to the purple, which is going to mean that I can't nest those seams. So what I want to make sure of is I want to make sure that I flip that seam allowance back and press the seam allowance towards the green so that when I come to sew them together, they're going to nest beautifully. So just make sure that when you press those seam allowances that they're pressed, both of them are pressed to the green. Okay, so here's our 3 blocks, all done like so. Now I just wanted to point out, you can see I've got quite a bit of fraying on the outside of these blocks. That's actually happened because I didn't starch my fabrics before I started. I'm a big fan of starch, so if you can, please starch your fabrics before you start and you won't end up with such bad fraying around the outside. Okay, next step is we need to add our blue strips. Now on the pattern I've told you that we need 1 strip that's 1 3/4 inches by 44 inches, but I'm working with fat quarters, so I've actually just got 2 pieces that measure 1 3/4 inches across by about 22 inches, and that will be fine too. So we're going to take one of those pieces and we're going to take it to the machine, and what we're going to do is we're going to add a strip of fabric down the outside edge of this block. And we're going to do this in the traditional Seminole piecing. What they usually do is they start with long strips, sew them together and then cut them apart. So that's what we're going to do with this piece. So what we need to do is we need to flip that over and we need to stitch that to our blue or my black fabric. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take the next piece and then I'm going to sew that one down the side as well, and then I'm going to take my final piece and sew that one down the side. So I'm going to do a real string piecing technique here. So you can see I'm going to join all 3 of my blocks onto the 1 strip of the blue fabric. Okay, so I've pressed my fabric towards the outside piece. I like to do that because I've got a seam in here, and if I ironed the seam allowance towards this piece, it would be a bit more bulky. So that's why I pressed it away from that one. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to come in and I'm going to line up my ruler across the top edge and I'm going to trim off that excess. Then I'm going to move down. Once again, I'm going to line up with the bottom edge of that block and trim it off. And so there's my first piece. I'll repeat that all the way down, so I'm lining it up across the top of the block. That's scrap. And then I'll line up across the bottom of the block. And there we go. So there's the 3 blocks. So now what I'll do is the exact same thing, but I need to add another piece of the blue fabric or the black fabric across this bottom edge. So I'm going to flip them all around. So this is the edge that I need to add it onto. So I don't want any of this fabric attaching to the side that has the yellows. So they're only along the green edges. So once again, I'll take this to the machine, flip that over and sew that down. Then I'll come to my next one, sew this one on, and then of course the last block as well. So I'll sew that one on as well. And we're nearly done. Okay, and there's our 3 finished blocks. Now what we need to do is we need to turn these on point because we're going to add them into our quilt on point. So what I like to do is spin them around because I've designed these to be kind of like little tulips. So I'm going to turn them around. So I've got the purple running through the top here, and then I've got the blue or black down the bottom. So I want them all on point like this. Then what I want to do is I want to take my background fabric that we cut earlier. So these are the pieces that are 5.5 inches by 6 inches. And what we want to do is we want to add one of these strips to the bottom of the piece. So the bottom edge, the bottom right hand side, we want to add 3 pieces of fabric along the bottom edge. We want to do that all the way along, and then we're also going to do that across the top edge as well. So we're going to put one at the top left hand side, and we're going to do that with all 3 blocks as well. So we're going to join those on, and then we're ready to move on. So we're going to join all of those pieces together. So you'll have a row like this, a row like this, and a row like this. Then what we want to do is we want to join the 3 together. Now I forgot to mention, this time I pressed my seam allowance towards the background fabric. What we want to do is we want to nest the little seam in here and sew this row to this row, and then we're going to repeat that process with our final block. Okay, and there we are. That's the finished, or not quite finished, but nearly finished row. So I've joined them all together down those sides there. Now I've pressed these just in one direction because there's no way that we could spiral these seams here. So I've just pressed them all to one side. Now what we need to do is we need to trim off the top and the bottom of the background fabric. Okay, so what I want to do is I want to measure 1/4 inch from these points. Okay, and I'm just going to trim across the top. Now this is quite a long seam and it's a bit of an awkward angle, so I'm just going to take it in sections, and I'm going to move my hand and just take it slowly so that I don't mess up. Okay, so there's the top half trimmed off. I'm going to turn this one around and trim off the other side as well. So there we go. So there's the 2 pieces trimmed up. Now what we need to do is we need to add another triangle on the ends. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to take, and you can just trim it off like that, I'm just going to take 2 of these triangles that we've trimmed off. I'll get rid of those, and I'm going to turn it around and add that onto the side here. And I'm going to do the same thing up this end. I'm going to add one of those triangles here. Now just make sure that you've got a bit of excess all across the top there, and more than 1/4 inch from this point here, because you want to make sure that it's going to fit. Okay, so I've sewn the corners on, and all we're left with to do now is to trim those up. So once again, I'm just going to line up the ruler with the point there and give myself an extra 1/4 inch from the point, and I'm going to line up that next one as well, just to make sure that I get this nice and straight. So I'm going to trim across the top edge and get rid of that. And to trim the edge here, what I need to do is I need to give myself an extra 1/4 inch here, but I also need to make sure that I'm cutting this square. So what I like to do is I like to find a ruler or a mark on my ruler to line up across the bottom edge. So then at least I know that this is going to be a perfect right angle. So I'm lining it up across that 9-inch measurement, and I've given myself the extra 1/4 inch, so I'll just trim that end off. And we've got a perfectly square end. That's the middle portion of the Seminole piecing all finished. The last thing to do is to add on our strips from the ends. So as I mentioned earlier, you should have 3 of these joined together. Just for today's demonstration, I've just done one section, but you want to add 1 set of 3 to this end here. So that will line up there, and you want to put another set of 3 down the opposite end. So you'll have one long strip with all the Storm Seminole piecing strips down this end. We've got our beautiful little tulip blocks in the middle, and then more Seminole piecing up the other end. So we put those together, and your finished row should measure 7.5 inches by, I think it's 60.5 inches. So that should be the measurements for the finished row. But if yours isn't quite high enough, don't worry about it, because it's not going to matter. If your row is a bit too long, and to be honest, I haven't done the measuring immaculately on this row, so you may need to remove a few of the strips from either end to get it to be the right size. So just double check that in the end it's the same measurement as all of your other rows. Once you've finished this row, you're ready to put your quilt together, or your quilt top. I'm going to give you a few extra weeks, so we're going to have a month until the next video. It'll help us get through the silly season, and then we're going to start quilting in January. So if you want to quilt your quilt all as one, you're ready now to join all your rows together. I've added a 1.5 inch strip, or 1 inch finished, between each of the rows, so you can do that if you like. If you're going to do quilt as you go, then just leave your strips finished, and we'll add those strips at the very end to cover up our seams when we do the quilt as you go method. So hang these on your wall and admire them, because congratulations, you're finished. I hope you've enjoyed making this quilt top. I've really had fun creating it for you, and I really look forward to seeing all of your pictures of your finished quilt tops on the Facebook group. Thanks for joining me, and I'll see you soon.